no further ado, Stephen. Hear what's going on.
Stephen and I have been working on our presentation for well over 10 minutes. And we're prepared to answer lots of questions for you. And what we thought we would do, tell me if I'm wrong, but we thought what we might do is just go back briefly in time, how we got to the original urban and rural reserves map, and then talk about some of the changes that have been made and what was in the recent legislation. I can talk a little bit about what the next steps are for the region's growth management decision, and maybe that's enough before we break, get a little snack, and then go to the question and answer period that was talked about. So does that make sense? That works for me. Okay. And I know, so again, I'm John Williams. I work at Metro. I've spoken in front of a number of you over the last 5-6 years, I think. Some of you will find me familiar. I was hired at Metro in January of 2008 to manage Metro as part of the Urban and Rural Reserves process. And so I feel like I've been working on it for a long time, but I know many of you and many others around the region have actually been involved for a lot longer. The origin of the legislation that was passed that allowed this region to do urban and rural reserves goes back in time to 10 years ago when we made the last set of urban growth boundary decisions for this region that, as we know, haven't all worked out quite the way folks anticipated. And so, we've got this timeline here that goes back to 2007, 2008. The idea was, could we get to a place where we had more predictability about what was going on, a longer-term plan, rather than talking about all of the places around the entire urban growth boundary every 5 years as required by state law? Was there a way that we could identify places that made sense to grow in, that would be designated urban reserves, and places that should be set aside from development for 50 years, the rural reserves? I know a lot of you know this, but I just thought I'd go really quickly through it. And so that was the idea of a pretty broad coalition of folks going down to the legislature and getting this authority that didn't previously exist. No one else in the state has the authority to do this urban and rural reserve designations. We had to get approval of it from the legislature. It's kind of interesting that it began and ended at the legislature. And so with that, in 2007 and 2008, I'll move fast, don't worry. Through 2007 and 2008 is when the process really started, and a lot of you folks started being involved as Metro led folks convening around the region with a reserve steering committee. Metro and Washington County, Clackamas County, and Multnomah County worked together. There were a lot of meetings out here in Washington County along the way. I know folks were very involved. Through 2008 and 2009, and I'm cutting short a lot of the process, we can get to it in questions and answers. But by 2009, 2010 is when we had really gotten to a plan that was a map that looked very much like this. Some of you were involved at that stage when we submitted it to approval in the middle of 2010. We got a remand from the Land Conservation and Development Commission, said we hadn't quite done it right. There were some issues to be addressed out here in Washington County and other places. But by by the fall of 2011, we had gotten to a regional plan that went back to the state of Oregon. And since then, as many of you know, we have been engaged in review of it by the Land Conservation and Development Commission again, and through the court system. And so that process, each step kind of took a year from there. I know a little bit more than a year ago, we were down in Salem in front of the Court of Appeals, and any of you were there or had representatives there arguing cases or arguing points about the final designations before the Court of Appeals in Salem. And then we had a year, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Stephen for a sec to talk about what's happened in the recent months.
So I'll fast forward up to the beginning of this year. Late last year, we were starting to hear that Representative John Davis was talking about introducing a bill in the House that initially the purpose was to just simply ratify or confirmed the UGB decisions that were made by Metro in 2011. And those are the pink areas that you see on the map here. So they were all in Washington County, right there. And that was roughly 2,000 acres. And so as a part of this process, those areas were all designated urban reserve in the 2011 decision. And so then the decision was made, those were appropriate areas to expand the growth boundary in 2012, late 11. So those areas, the planning's been going on in them. So those areas are South Hillsborough, the River Terrace area in Tigard, and South Cooper Mountain in Beaverton, and then up in North Hillsborough, sort of an industrial area there. So the planning's been moving ahead on all of those areas, with the sort of the cloud over them about what's going to happen when we get the reserves decision back from the Court of Appeals. Is that going to call these expansions into question? So the initial intent of the bill was just simply to verify or confirm those 4 UGB area expansions and allow the planning to go ahead and proceed for expansion of the UGB into those areas. So in February, the Court of Appeals issued its decision on the urban and rural reserves appeal, and it essentially reversed and remanded back to Washington County, or to Metro and Washington County through DLCD, the decisions that were made in Washington County on the reserves, and there was some finding from the court that the county hadn't applied some of the factors appropriately. So given that issue, I think everybody sort of realized that the options ahead of us were we can try to address the remand, but then we may find ourselves addressing several years more through the process of going back through analysis and reviewing that locally, then at the state level, and then back to the courts, presumably. So we were looking at a number of years probably tied up still in that process. So I think the representatives that were sponsoring the original bill saw this as an opportunity to try to bring together a coalition of the folks that were involved in the appeal, the counties, the cities that were affected, and to try to basically strike a bargain. So that's where we're at right now. And as of last Thursday, I believe it was, the Senate passed, so it was earlier in the week, I guess, but the Senate passed House Bill 4078 unanimously. It's sitting on the governor's desk at this point to be signed. And so it basically confirmed the 2011 UGB expansions. It added an additional 1,200 or so acres to the urban growth boundary immediately. Took some urban reserve areas and made them rural reserves. Took some rural reserves, made them undesignated, which means they're neither urban or rural reserve. Those are sort of the yellow areas, or actually these green areas were the areas that became, no, I'm sorry. So so I guess it's sort of yellowish areas are the so anyway, there were a number of changes that were made in the process, and so this is sort of our attempt at the county, based on our understanding of the way the legislation is written, to try to depict the changes in a map. There's also a map that's posted on the legislative website that sort of shows changes, but this is a little more comprehensive attempt to try to do that. So you're welcome at the break time to come up. I apologize, I know you can't read this from back there, but you're welcome to come up and take a look at it, and I'll stick around and answer questions if you have. I'll try to answer questions if you have. So that's really where we are today. We've just gotten to this point. This is all fairly new. The dust is settling. We're trying to we're still in the process of trying to confirm that we have an accurate understanding of what these lines on the map look like as a result of the changes in the legislation. And now we're going to be looking at what our next steps are in the process. And this is where John can jump back in too, but I know that we'll be, this is one of the things that we know we've got are these additional urban growth boundary expansion areas. So one of the first things that we're going to need to do is start working with our partners in the region, Metro, and the affected cities that are going to be planning for those areas, and just sort of mapping out what the process looks like to continue the planning for those urban growth boundary expansions. We'll continue working with our partners that are doing the planning in those pink areas that were brought into the UGB back in 2011. So South Hillsborough, North Hillsborough, River Terrace, and South Cooper Mountain. And then I think there are some unanswered questions, honestly, at this point about what this all means for the future. And there were a couple of interesting provisions in the bill, so maybe this is an opportunity to jump into that.
Before you do that, will the governor sign it?
It's our understanding that it will be signed.
And if he signs it, how firm are we now? I mean, as a 35-year-long landowner, it hasn't been very firm for a while.
So what the bill does is it does settle the appeals that have been filed on the urban and rural reserves decision and also the urban growth boundary decision. So in Washington County. So if the governor signs the bill, what you have is you have a final map of urban and rural reserves in Washington County and a new urban growth boundary for the metro region in Washington County. So I think that's what you do have is that kind of long-term certainty. So maybe just a couple of things. That's a great question. And we're still working out. I mean, in the final days of the session, as the Senate was working on the bill, they were still talking about the exact boundaries. And was it the center line of roads, or was it the creek, and which creek? And it was coming together really fast because of the short session. So actually, this is the first. This is actually the first printed map I've seen of what the legislation actually created. Stephen and I will try to answer questions as well as we can, but there are a number of changes. And so I think a couple of things going forward that you touched on, that's right. So we do have this, the urban reserves and the rural reserves and the undesignated areas all still in place. I think if you look at the broad scheme, the broad plan for the region, it's a very similar plan that we all came to working together in this region. Some of the boundaries are a little different, and we brought a little land through this deal into the urban growth boundary a little faster than was expected, but it's a very similar idea. So we have those, as Steve mentioned, there's a couple of places now that need to do some planning for what is going to happen. So these areas outside of Cornelius, Forest Grove, and North Hillsborough, some planning that's going to be needed to talk about what sort of development happens in those places. And then another piece of the puzzle is that our state-mandated every 5 years review of the urban growth boundary and our region's ability to accommodate population and employment growth for 20 years. Every 5 years we do that, resulted in the UGB additions that were talked about. We're in the middle of that process now. So while the last decision was held up in courts, we were still required, Metro and cities and all of you were still required to do that process again. And we are kind of in the middle of it right now. So we're expecting that in December of 2015, there will be another growth management decision by the Metro Council. That's the decision where the council decides whether there is enough land inside the urban growth boundary to accommodate that job and population growth that we expect. And the changes that were made in this legislation will have some interesting effects on that decision that we didn't quite expect. So I think there's a number of questions that you may have that we'd be happy to answer about that. But we're still kind of reading the language in the legislation and figuring out exactly what it means for us.
So it seems what you're saying is that 50-year plan is good for 2 years.
The 50-year plan hopefully is good for 50 years now.
It's subject to change in 2 years.
No, so what the 50-year plan does is it designates these rural reserves. These are areas that we cannot, by state law, expand the urban growth boundary into for the next 50 years. It also designates urban, the region, the entire region. The Metro Council, in the end, the folks I work for, in the end, make the decision, but they make it in partnership with everyone here and cities and counties. And so we have the rural reserves, we have the urban reserves, and every 5 years we are required, Metro is required by state law, to look at the urban growth boundary and decide if there's enough land inside the urban growth boundary. So we operate within this broad map, and every 5 years we'll be looking to see if any of the urban reserves will come into the urban growth boundary and be eligible for urbanization.
I think the clarification we would make is that the urban reserves, not the rural reserves. The
Right.
rural reserves are site for site for the next 50 years.
Yes, that's right. That is right.
Okay, I want that to be clear.
Yes, as I remember reading somewhere, or I heard somewhere, that there was terms in 4078, is that correct?
4078, yeah.
That they cannot, no agency can move out onto undesignated land until 75% of the already designated urban lands have been used. Is that still in effect?
That's exactly right. That is in the legislation. So there's certainly been a concern or a question on some people's part as to what are those undesignated areas, neither urban nor rural. And this legislation clarifies that they could be used for urban development in the future, but you'd have to use 75% of the urban reserves in order to get there. Now that applies per county. So that's Washington County, 75%, Clackamas, and Multnomah. Just one thing that we haven't mentioned is that the court decision we talked about had implications also for Clackamas County and Multnomah County. The legislation didn't address that, and so there are still legal challenges to a couple of the designations in those other counties. Those are going to follow the normal legal process. They've been remanded back to the region, and we'll have to address them that way. Yes, ma'am.
Well, now I noticed that like we have so many homes that are being built. We already have like a huge population here in Hillsborough and abroad. But the thing is like there's so much of wildlife land that's actually being taken up to build these, new developments that are actually high priced for people. I mean, it's supposed to help the economy, but it's actually not because the prices are too high for the homes, and we have so many empty buildings and homes. Why don't we use those?
Why don't we use the lands we already have, the places we already have?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yeah, because
Well-
I mean, like, just around here, there's a lot of businesses, nobody's using them. Why don't they use those to, for whatever type of business?
Well, I think that's the first place we always look. And so this region does a pretty good job, actually, at reusing lands when we can. And there's certainly examples we can all think of places that have sat vacant for a while, or buildings that have sat vacant for a while, and sometimes there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think we do a pretty good job, actually, around here of trying to take advantage of those places that are already inside the urban growth boundary before we expand. The Metro Council certainly takes a very close look at that before they expand. I think generally it's safe for me to say the council's policy position is try to do as much of that as is feasible before expanding the urban growth boundary. And I would also
take those into account. Is that part of what you were taking into account?
Yes. So every 5 years we do something called, stop me before I get too geeky, but we do something called an urban growth report where we have 20-year population and employment forecasts for our region. And we do a very detailed inventory of the lands that we have. We actually take aerial photos and go property by property to understand what's out there and what's vacant, what might be redeveloped. And the council requires that we look at all of that very carefully before expanding the urban growth boundary. What I was going to say, the Metro Council's policy position has traditionally been to be very conservative, adding lands before and making sure that we've done everything we can do to redevelop. One just an illustration of that, I know there are places where I've seen a tremendous amount of change in the last 10, 15 years. There certainly is land that gets added, land that gets developed. One thing that I think is always interesting about the Urban and Rural Reserves Plan in our region is that we're expecting over 50 years possibly a 75% population increase in this region over those 50 years. And the urban reserves add up to an 11% increase in footprint for this region, which is, I have to tell you, it's tremendously different than any other place in the country. Maybe Ethan has some numbers on that, but there are places that the footprint grows as much or more as the population, double the population. And in this region, it's more like a fifth or a tenth. It's a tremendous difference from the way other places do. And so I think, in general, we try to do a pretty good job on this, but there's always examples that we can cite. So I appreciate the question. It's something that we can probably talk about in the second half, too.
Excuse me, Robert. We're really anxious to get your comments and your questions for the next step, so I would request that perhaps you could take 2 more questions, and then we'll go into
Sure,
the
we're totally, you're the
And I was
engineer,
hoping
you
that
tell me.
fine fellows might stay for a while.
Yeah,
Right, right
and
after.
actually, after the break, we'll come back and give you a chance to keep asking questions. Very silly about stuff, so we're locked in.
2 more questions, then we'll
I've got some questions too.
Maybe it's sort of, right now, kind of clarifying questions about the map or the bill or what urban reserves are, and then after it's more like, how is it, where do we go? So,
Where do we go with the next step?
I was just about to call on you, sir.
Just a question for Stephen, really, there are two parts. One is the land use and transportation was moving ahead with the long-range plan. And two was the metrics. Is that now going to continue to move ahead, or are we still waiting for the governor's signature?
Well, I think at this point, I mean, we obviously need to wait until the governor signs the bill, but it seems all but certain he's going to. So I think we're, you know, it's not too early for us to start reaching out. We've been engaging with Metro already. We're going to be reaching out, engaging with Berkeley and Forest Grove very quickly. Again, we just know we need to get the ball rolling on figuring out what we're going to do with these new UGB expansion areas. There's some immediate issues that we need to deal with. Do we want to go in and change the zoning to a county? We have a sort of a holding zone called future development, so we want to go in and proactively change the zoning in those areas to the future development district, or do we want to just work with the cities if they're in a position to go out and annex those lands immediately and start the planning on their own? Do we go that route? And Metro plays a part in that in terms of reviewing, working with them on their comprehensive plan amendments and planning work. So there's a lot of work to be done in those areas, so we'll get going on it pretty soon.
He's given us the answer to that. So maybe last question.
I got a question on the map, if you could address it a little bit about the creation of the map. Metro doesn't have any mapping. And Arguello, I believe it was in Oregon, has something that's been in and attached to, rather loosely attached to the 4078 House bill. How did we create this map? Metro have any involvement with this, or is this Washington County?
It's a Washington County map, but we're trying to work together to make sure that we all end up with the same map. Let me actually go a step further. Guarantee that we will all use the same map. We've seen some bad maps recently too, and some of the maps that have been in the paper have not been right. And as I said, the boundaries were changing real fast at the last minute, and I think people were on deadline and getting things together. So hopefully this map is pretty good right now, and we'll all be working off the same map.
Well, it looks like, now, did somebody hand color some of the newer editions, or was that generated vis-a-vis electronics, or?
Yeah, these are electronic maps, so we do go in and sort of draw these boundary lines in there on the mapping. And to John's point, our map folks are coordinating pretty closely with Metro's folks too, because again, we want to make sure that we're interpreting this thing the same and that all of our maps look the same.
Maybe John would indicate what's timeline look like on Metro? Your map is excellent.
Oh, well, with that intro, we should, I think we're getting the electronic files from his folks, and we'll have the map probably next week, I would imagine.
And you're going to be here during the break, so if somebody wants to do that further.
Yeah, I'd have got a piece of come on up.
Okay, let's take a short break. Come back in about 7 minutes and 42 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's get up and get some.
My name is Ethan Seltzer. I'm on the faculty at Portland State. I'm glad to be out here to help just field questions and kind of make sure the conversation moves along. As was said at the beginning, you know, we're not here to kind of solve a problem or come up with a plan. We're here to make sure that you've got answers to the questions that you have, and that you get a chance to talk with your friends and neighbors through this process about what happens next and where we go from here. I do ask that if you ask a question, make a comment, keep them brief and keep them loud, because I understand we have some people here in the audience who have a little trouble hearing. I'm one of them. So if you can make yourselves heard, and if you don't, I will repeat what you said as best I can and make it heard that way. That would be great. The other thing that the host wanted me to announce is that there is a candidates forum coming up Wednesday, March 19th. So that's a week from this Wednesday, 7 to 9 p.m. Here in this very room. This very room. District 4 race and the county chair race candidates will all be here. You get a chance to hear what they've got to say. So again, candidates fair, a week from Wednesday, March 19th, 7 to 9 p.m. right here in this room.
Let your friends know.
Let your friends know. Right. Good chance to get up and close and personal with people who are around. So this process has raised a lot of questions, and I guess the place that we can start is where we just left off with it, which is, well, what kind of happens next? John, got a question for you.
Okay.
Come on up.
Okay.
Put that phone away. Silence your cell phone. So, you mentioned that Metro is at the beginning of a process to reassess the overall adequacy of the urban land supply. How will that process be different now that we've gone through this legislative process?
Well, technically and legally, it's the same. So we still do the same thing we always do, which is we make 20-year forecasts of population and employment. We start with a 7-county region, and we get down to what is the forecast within the urban growth boundary. What's different, and so technically, legally, and maybe even politically, it's still kind of the same. We still have folks interested in bringing land in. We have folks interested in adding no land. We have a lot of people in the middle. And the difference is that now we have a new set of lands to be looking at. We've sort of halfway through our technical process to figure out how much land supply is available, and now we have a bunch more places to look at because those areas around Cornelius and Forest Grove were added in, right? Which show as right. So these areas are now in the UGB, so we have to count them in our supply. So let's imagine these are probably a lot of residential. And so we look at our land supply regionally. And if we had a need for housing a month ago, we may not have as much of a need for housing now because we have this added land for housing in our urban growth boundary. And so I think the process is going to look a lot the same. The timeline will be kind of the same. The numbers may be a little bit different, but I don't think the discussion is actually all that different.
Okay, so is this to say that
regionally,
that state law was not changed by the Senate legislation?
I was trying to keep it simple. State law was changed a little bit. There were two things that are a little bit different. One is that we went from an every 5-year requirement to an every 6-year requirement. And that just gives us a little extra time. What we found historically is that the process takes a long time and then we get sued and it lasts a long time. And so, as you heard me say earlier, the 5-year hamster wheel, we were still always engaged in the last one when we were moving forward on the next one. So we gave ourselves a little more breathing room. The other thing that did change a little in state law, you can hit me if I shouldn't say this, this area in North Hillsborough that was added into the urban growth boundary as part of the bargain that was struck, where urban reserves were taken away outside of Hillsborough, and in exchange, Hillsborough got more land in its urban growth boundary now. That land is planned for employment uses, and under the state legislation, we will not be counting it this time around for employment land. The reason for that is that all the other jurisdictions around the boundary in the other counties, and even in Washington County, said, okay, if you're adding in all this employment land now, we'll never get our chance. And so this time around, under state law, we will not be counting this as part of the region's employment land supply. It kind of gives other jurisdictions a chance to prove that they can meet some of the region's needs. So I know that's kind of technical, but
Sure.
that's the answer.
But that's good. That doesn't mean this land can be used for residential or commercial or something else. It's essentially going to wait.
Right. It will be planned and zoned and developed by Hillsborough, and as they find employment land needs, they can utilize it. It's now inside the urban growth boundary. If they can build streets to it, sewer lines, and all of that stuff.
Question?
Yeah, this seems to expose something about the way y'all operate. Because earlier you talked about the 75% fulfillment before you expand. But you're also now talking about granularity of what's within that 75%, the residential, employment generating, and so on. So it gets obviously gets a little fancier than just 75% utilization. Can we look at, I'm new to the urban reserve. I'm that little West Union blue there.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks. And so The question I would have is, do you all know what that urban reserve is destined to become? Is it, I mean, can you tell me, is it going to be residential or is it going to be one?
Well, so I work in Metro, the regional government. I think the answer to that question is better answered by the cities and by the county and by the property owners who would be doing the planning for that area.
But before we drill down too deeply into this question, which is a good question, we're not going to leave it. I believe Jason Miner is here, who's with Thousand Friends of Oregon. Going casual tonight, so sorry to kind of call on you, but you were in the room when the legislation was put together, or close to it anyway?
I was outside the room.
Outside the room. Okay. So, to the best of your knowledge, okay, thanks. To the best of your knowledge, was state law about how urban growth boundaries are amended or assessed changed by this legislation?
I think John hit the 2 points that I was familiar with.
Okay.
I think there was a technicality around Cornelius and Forest Grove. I don't know how those lands are counted. Maybe you do.
They're, that should
Can you repeat his comments, please?
He said he agreed with what John said about the 2 points that were changed. One, to go from a 5-year to a 6-year period, and the second, to go from essentially looking at all potential land and urban growth boundaries for all uses to basically hold off looking at these lands that were added to the urban growth boundary for purposes of calculating land available for employment. Okay.
right. And so is there, can I answer his question? Sure. So what will happen, so the area you're talking about now is an urban reserve. It's eligible to be added to the urban growth boundary someday. Metro requires that before that decision is made that a plan for that area be developed. So whatever it is, the property owners working together with the cities that would provide services, with the special districts that would provide the infrastructure, all get together, develop a plan that would be submitted and discussed at the regional level before that area was brought in. So you'll have a say in what that area might look like. Yeah.
You mentioned the 6-year clock was set versus the 5-year now.
Mm-hmm.
When did the clock start and when is the 6 years then actually up?
So what the clock is state law actually requires that Metro every 5 years complete that assessment that I talked about. So we do the forecast and we do the inventory of the lands and we present the region with an assessment of the need. And then the policymakers get together along with all of you and make their magic and make a decision. So that will now be, that is due in December of this year, that accounting. And what the law says is that the next one is going to be due in 6 years. So the next one will be due in 2020 instead of in 2019.
So the 5 years still playing right now, and then this next round will be 6 years.
That's correct.
Exactly right.
Question?
Yeah, it has to do with the blue area there in West Union. So my question is, Metro has a mission to take to the urban growth boundary for 2 things. We need to save farmland, and we need to create livable communities, right?
Couldn't have said it better.
All right. So I think 1,000 Friends has that mission too. So the blue area north of Rock Creek takes exclusive farmland and draws a boundary on a creek that has 30 acres of Metro's land. Sorry. Is it kind of like the game show if you're still talking? Can you finish?
Yeah, you can. It's like basketball. The ball is in the air.
But I don't have to answer. So.
So my question is, this goes against the mission of the Metro, this goes against 1,000 Friends. There were no citizens from that area in the room. If we were going to take farmland, at least taking the corner to allow for folks north of 26 to have a place for urban work lofts or satellite offices or some sort of commercial building up there, those boundaries, yes, sir, you will get invited to a meeting to watch the most highest density housing be built above your neighborhood. Go look to North Bethany. It's the highest density thing there. So I just don't understand how we got there.
Okay, so the question is, how can, if our objective with the urban growth boundary is to preserve farmland and to build great communities, how is it that we're taking farmland for urban uses and maybe putting urban uses in places where it's going to be difficult to make a great community? Okay. And let me just say parenthetically that the urban growth boundary, as it was envisioned in state law, was never envisioned as a great wall, because there was recognition that at some points in time, additional urban land would be needed. But at the same time, the expectation was, to the extent possible, we would avoid using important farmland. And that the way that we made that decision at this point in time is through the designation of urban and rural reserves. And so through whatever process this one now kind of created by the legislature, we now have an urban reserve here, which doesn't mean it's necessarily coming into the urban growth boundary now, but it means that if there is a need for additional urban land, this is where they will look first. But I think this does raise some issues.
Among all the other urban reserves around the boundary.
Right.
All over the region.
All over the region, among all those urban reserves. And so I think this brings up actually a really interesting question that we got through the cards. Two of them, actually. One is about citizen participation. And maybe, you guys feel free to jump in, maybe others here who have some experience with this. And that is, well, in the statewide planning program, the first goal actually is not the urban growth boundary, and it's not preserved farmland. The first goal is citizen involvement. So what does this mean about citizen involvement going forward? Citizens go to these meetings about this blue area. Does this mean that if there's a disagreement, the legislature will leap in and basically make the decision for local communities? Or, was this some strange meteor that blasted across the sky and landed in Central? Anyone have any sense about that, John?
Yeah, and Tom, if you could just start the button right now. One question that goes to the transparency that's envisioned by citizen involvement goal 1. And in Clackamas County and in Multnomah County, we had citizen participation committees. In Washington County, we set up a committee of mayors with one vote for farming that was split between these two gentlemen back here.
I didn't get any vote.
Oh, you didn't get
Did he hog the whole vote?
I want to make a comment about what you just said. Because there wasn't going to be any rural representation. Your county commissioner from District 4 was going to represent the rural area. And he came to the Farm Bureau meeting and we said, you are not going to represent the farmers because we're the Farm Bureau and we're kind of the farm advocacy group here. And we want 15 farmers or foresters to match up with these 15 cities. And we got 2 farmers and 1 vote. So every time we voted, it was 15 to 1.
That was his time, right?
Yeah.
Let me raise this issue. Because first of all, I want to thank both Steve and John for being here. You're not the decision makers. Originally, this meeting was with decision makers, but you were part of the whole process. Okay, we used the public meetings law to get transparency. And what we found was that there was a whole series of efforts that took place early on to set up the votes. And this was, I could read from a memo that Tom Bryan wrote to Brent Curtis saying, let's have John Williams do the maps. We want to keep things totally confidential, not let people know that we've decided Helvetia is going to be the place where we're going to get our urban reserves after Cornelius has been put out. Okay, what I'm asking for you gentlemen who have been involved in this is, when you look back on it, are there things we can do to improve citizen involvement and participation? Because otherwise, we're going to be in the legislature. And the legislature, yes, they have public hearings, and yes, they have committees, but the process that we went through was a whirlwind process, and it was not thorough. The only reason it was thorough was because we had a record that had been set that they were able to focus on, that had been developed over that period of time, and had been developed by the court to some extent. So you gentlemen, as people who are standing there on behalf of your agency, what do you honestly feel about citizen participation, and what kind of things can we do to improve it for the next round?
Good question. And let me just warn you that, we hear what these guys have to say, but let's also hear what you've got to say, because I think ultimately for a CPO, this is probably one of the most fundamental questions. What should citizen participation in these activities look like? What should it mean? And what should we be able to expect? So we'll come back to you. So no one gets out of this.
But these are the insiders. Sure. These gentlemen have been doing it, and I think an honest discussion about it would be really helpful.
Let's hear what they've got to say.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to start with Washington County.
Sure. This is like that scene in the movie. After you. No. After you. It's okay. We're in Washington County. That's
what I thought.
Well, I think you raise a great point, John. I think citizen involvement is a key part of this. Sure. So citizen involvement is a key part of the process. I wasn't involved in the process, so I don't know what happened personally. But clearly this raises some questions. I think the grant bargain itself raises some questions about what's the appropriate level of involvement in those kind of decisions. So I think if there's a takeaway, it's that we probably don't want to have this become a precedent where the legislature starts making all these decisions, like you said, in the process, but it's not probably the best process. I think one of the things, and again, I'm not having been involved in this, but I think one of the reasons that this deal was able to sort of be arrived at so quickly was that there had been so much discussion. And I think everybody knew where everybody stood on the issues going into this, sort of grant bargain process. So I think it was pretty easy for people to sort of finally come together and just say, okay, here are some things that we can deal with and live with, and let's try to take advantage of the opportunity here and let's move on. So what that means for the future, I think, great question, and I don't have the answer for you, but I think it certainly points to some areas where we can all probably do better as agencies. So, okay.
Well, I was, as you say, I was very involved for a long time, and it was an interesting process. It was challenging for us to design a process that Metro shared with each of the counties, and there were different approaches taken by each county. There's no doubt there were. It's hard to say that there wasn't a lot of opportunity for citizens to get involved and participate, but there certainly were decisions that were made by, in the end, by your elected officials. Well, hopefully not at the beginning. There was, I managed our side for I've been at it for 6 years now, and there were a lot of opportunities for input. And I hear what you say, and I remember those Washington County, I remember those meetings.
November 10th.
Some of those votes, yeah. That's right. So I think we could talk about what the best way to structure it could have been, would have been, but it probably is more relevant to talk about what we do from here going forward.
Okay.
Which I heard you say. In answer to Ethan's question, I think and I hope that what just happened in the legislature, particularly being a short session, it was a runaway train. It was happening so fast that I spent all of my days on text messages trying to answer questions and figure out boundaries and all of that stuff. It was very fast, and it's true. Property owners were not in some of the rooms where the decisions were being made. I don't think that's the precedent we want in this state. I'm a big believer in the land use system, and I believe in goal one. Now, we can find ways to figure out how involved everyone is. But I think the one thing we can probably all agree on is that we don't want the legislature to be doing stuff like this all that often. There's already some talk about 2015, and they're going to fix Bend, and they're going to fix 6 Woodburn, and I think that's not the precedent we all want to do. When the original House bill was up, the Metro Council, your county commissioners, everyone was down there saying, don't get involved in this. Do not do that. When the court decision came down and it was obvious that there were going to be years more of process, I think that's when and when the legislators, really what it was, the legislators said, we've got the votes to do a plan. And that's when we all got in the room and tried to make it as good a plan as we could. So I agree, there's
Okay, so we got Russ Dondero and then Catherine, okay? And then Linda, and then in the back there. Sean. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to the politics of what I saw in the legislature. has 4078 evolved on the political side, Professor retired in Sydney. I'm down there representing
Tom.
WC can, but in this particular issue, I really was involved in more as a political science person who's very active in the legislature as an activist. And I think the legislature has no stomach for doing this on a regular basis. They said that time and again in the hearing, all of which I attended. They also said it for the record. You can check the record for that. But I want to say, as I've said editorially many times, that Chair Clem and Chair Holby and Ben Unger and Representative Davis did a marvelous job of carving together a resolution to a problem which, had they not stepped into, we would have been sitting here by the testimony mentioned in the hearings for the next 4 to 6 years unresolved. So, you know, the fact is your legislature did its job as it was supposed to do, but it did it because you had a group of active citizens who challenged the original decision in Washington County, who took it to court. The court did its job, and then the legislature was confronted with the reality. Do we craft a decision that is reasonable, or do we just let it slip away? Keep in mind, Multnomah County and Clackamas County still have a long way to go, and the legislature is not stepping on their toes. They're letting them do it. So just the egregious example of Washington County, where they felt they had no options. So I think, quite frankly, the process worked very well under extremely difficult circumstances.
Catherine.
Well, I think just as a Washington County resident, that the process didn't have to come to that point. And I'm not hearing a big change in Washington County and what might happen. Ideally, what I'd like to hear is we have something like this come up without any kind of preconceived notions. We start getting citizens to come in before there's any maps at all. You know, when the whole urban-rural reserve process came up, that's when you needed a citizen group. Where do we go from here? Instead of Washington County crafting it, then coming, having many, many hearings where people came up and said something. And the real feeling when you went to those meetings, when you got up and said something, as I did many times, was, okay, this is the extent of citizen participation. We will sit here and decide what we want to decide. Yes, you can stand up and say what you want to say, but it doesn't really make a big difference to what we've already decided here.
So that was a pretty common experience for people here in this room? And not the experience you were expecting?
No.
No.
Sadly, we come to
Did you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I want to look a little bit forward, and I want to be a little more assertive about what we need to do to protect the citizen access that I see as the absolutely central part of the land use process. It was citizen involvement that found the errors in the way Washington County had evaluated land for rural reserves. We took that to our county board. Silence. I mean, it didn't make any difference. We took that to Metro. Metro was deferring to the county. They were looking for consensus. We took it to LCDC. The first time LCDC said, yes, there are problems with this, and they sent it back. They didn't, however, get a written opinion to us for about a year. And in that time, when there were no kinds of rules about what staff could talk with what other staff and so on, all of this correspondence went on that's detailed in John's letter, and there's a copy of it back there. So that when we did finally come back to public hearings again on the revisions, the votes were already in and tallied, and the officials were being polite to us most of the time. What we need to do in the legislature, at Washington County, at Metro, everything that they do about citizen involvement, we need to insist that citizen involvement starts at the earliest stages of planning, just like Catherine said. One of the things that opened my eyes about the bargaining that went on a couple of weekends ago was that when you get people who are key folks, key stakeholders in something that's highly contentious and highly complex, when you get them together with some skilled mediators, in this case it was some of our legislators and the guy from, Richard Whitman from the governor's office, and you are empowered to offer them some incentives to come to agreement on something that they can both live with, you can get agreement in a pretty short period of time. If that kind of process were going on at the beginning of a land use effort, whether it's an ordinance, whether it's a big, huge project, whether it's reserves, if that kind of process were going on at the local level, we could move up to the ordinance period with some agreements already made and people testifying in hearings about how, yes, they might want this or that, but in general, this ordinance will work. We've never had a county board that was willing to take that risk. But we have to insist on it because that's the only way that it works when we have problems this complex to be worked out among communities and citizens who have legitimate interests in how those things turn out. And there's another thing we have to work for too. Do not believe that the system is broken. The system is stressed, but the system works. The system delivered what it's supposed to. It did protect farmland. Almost all the places where there was foundation farmland got protected. And the system works to urge development inside the urban growth boundary. And that's what it's supposed to do. But there's one more piece that has to happen, and that is that each level of government has to take seriously its responsibility for checking the work of the government below. Washington County has to submit stuff to Metro. The Metro Council was just fine with whatever Washington County did. I'm sorry, that's the way it looked from where I sat. Metro's work goes to Land Conservation and Development Commission. They're supposed to check it. They did it once. The second time they were told from the governor's office on down, this is an important consensus process. We're supposed to defer to the local area. This is new law. We're going to have to, don't mess with it. Even if it isn't what you would like to have them choose, let it go. Well, it had to go all the way to the Court of Appeals before somebody actually did the review that should have been done at Metro. So,
and one thing we can be sure of, there's no citizen involvement at the Court of Appeals.
No.
No.
But those are the accountability from level of government to level of government, and accountability to citizens at early stages of planning. That's what we have to work for, and we have to work for at every opportunity we get in CPOs, in
Sounds relatively simple. So, Sean, you're at a point.
So there's one thing I'm a bit confused on. So, as I understand it, the court said the county commissioners didn't do the process correctly.
Didn't do the analysis correctly.
So, my question is, when are the county commissioners going to roll out the new process? I mean, you were saying that it's already in process. I mean, everything's going forward. When are they going to add that citizen involvement? When are they going to add the new plan, the new process, instead of just moving forward with the old process that you were saying, which is happening, which is guaranteed, to go to the courts again, right?
So, and this may be more of a question for Stephen, really. So, the court case we're talking about was specifically about the urban and rural reserves and the map. So what the legislature just did was finalize it. It's done. There's no more appeals. There's no more court case. There's no more urban and rural reserves process. That map is done. And so for the next 50 years. And so some of the things that you folks are talking about are about how citizen involvement works generally. And I think you're probably talking not just about urban and rural reserves, but about other projects. There will be concept planning of areas that happens. There's transportation planning. So some of what I'm hearing is more about that and how you work together in an ongoing way.
Well, like the urban growth boundary, every 6 years you're saying for that.
Right. So that urban growth boundary decision, there are lots of opportunities for that citizen involvement to happen. All I'm saying is just warning you that there's no more citizen involvement on urban and rural reserves. It's the next step down. It's how do we use these urban reserves? And I think the planning efforts of what places get planned and how they get brought in, those are traditionally led by the cities. Okay. So the cities would be doing that next stage of work.
But John, hold on, isn't it true though that before those urban reserves can be used, there's got to be a demonstration that there's a need for additional urban land, and that process itself has a requirement for significant citizen involvement?
It does indeed. I will tell you that it's pretty difficult. I've been doing long-range planning for a long time. It's pretty difficult to get that, and I'm hearing a lot of interested folks. I'd be happy to come out and talk to you about the technical analysis we do on population forecasting and land supply and all of that. What I'm here to tell you is that it's difficult to get input at that time. It's really when it starts being about maps and places that folks get interested in. And so there is an opportunity right now, and I'll give you my business card. We can talk about that work that we're doing now to figure out what the need is. So there is an opportunity in that right now.
But just to be clear, because I think this is kind of related to that, there are going to be land use decisions about these undesignated areas, right? At some point, or are they going to remain undesignated?
Well, so we mentioned the 75% rule was mentioned earlier a couple of times. The undesignated areas, they continue to be, they're pretty much what they are now. They're rural zoning. They would not have anything else happen until the urban reserves get mostly used, and if the region continues to have a need, then they might.
Okay, so anything happens with the undesignated areas that changes its existing zoning, anything at all, there'll be a public process around that. And certainly if it comes inside the urban growth boundary, there'll be a public process around that. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a public process around both assessing the need for urban land as well as potentially adding urban land to the urban growth boundary. And there's going to be a public process around the use of these new areas within the urban growth boundary that will be run by Washington County and the cities who are most affected.
Yeah, the cities will take
mostly the cities.
Okay, cities are going to take a lead, but that's going to be happening relatively soon.
Yeah, we imagine. I mean, we haven't had a chance to even sit down and talk to them yet. But.
Okay, so the net result is that the basic structure of this map, as John said, is done. The legislature's done that. But all of these colors on the map are actually, you got to almost look at them as dynamic pieces. They're moving. Their future is going to get worked out. Some of them not for a long time. The green areas are not going to be touched for 50 years. But these other colors are going to be the subject of intense scrutiny and debate in 2015 and then every 6 years after that. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
That is accurate. Okay. So public involvement is going to be really important because if every time there's if every time a decision is made locally which does not adequately provide findings, we'll be back at the Court of Appeals and then presumably back at the legislature. But we don't want to do that, right? No. So what are we going to do to avoid that, I guess is the question. Well, maybe some people here have some ideas. 1 second, let's get some people who haven't talked to.
I had a quick question regarding
Sure.
the 75% rule. Now, does the 75% rule encompass ownership for potential use or actual use?
So,
in other words, say I have 85 acres and I put 5 acres of office park on it. And I might use it, but I'm using it as a park right now. But I own the whole 75 acres. Is that 70-acre park considered used or designated for use, or, I mean, does that go to the 75% rule?
So
Do I have to develop the rest of the 75% of that
the
property?
way the 75% rule, it's what it actually says is that the area would have to be added to the urban reserve would have to be added to the urban growth boundary, planned and zoned for urban uses.
For specific uses?
Once that happens, so zoned and annexed. And once that happens, then it would count as
So I
being
wouldn't
used.
have to have actual plans submitted for development.
That's correct. And so I'm not sure if you're saying that as a theoretical or you have land that's applies
Oh,
to.
I don't have land.
Right, so.
I'd love to have 75 acres.
Let's
but-
imagine you own undesignated area, and I think it's probably pretty safe to say that the vast majority of undesignated areas wouldn't be looked at for quite some time. I'm guessing we're talking 20 years from now. But in order for that to happen, the urban reserve areas, which are purple, mostly purple, yeah, they're all purple on this map, I guess. There's a lot of colors happening here. Those 75% of those in Washington County would had to be added to the urban growth boundary, annexed and zoned for urban uses in order that we could even legally look at adding any of the yellow.
But not actually used.
That's right. But let me just tell you that on top of that, there's the urban growth boundary decision, and in the urban growth boundary decision, we have to look at that actual use question. So we wouldn't add land to the urban growth boundary if there was huge chunks of these urban reserves that were just sitting there unused. We don't presume they're used for that purpose. So
Good question.
There's an undesignated area south of South Hillsborough. It's about maybe a half mile long. It runs next to 209th. That area is going to need a transportation corridor put through it before there's 75% development elsewhere. Is that an allowed usage in an undesignated area?
yes, in an undesignated area, the same things can happen as could happen now. So the urban and rural, the undesignated, basically it's exactly the same as it is now for that purposes. It's difficult to build transportation facilities in rural reserves, but in the undesignated, this is more of a Washington County question actually, because it's unannexed rural lands. But it would be just like transportation facilities have been built out here. That's still possible to do.
Okay, it's the end of Cornelius.
Maybe Stephen should also answer.
Yeah, no, you're right on point.
It's the end of Cornelius Pass Road that needs to be extended to at least to Farmington down there to get the north-south.
So having that undesignated doesn't preclude that opportunity.
Well, does it?
It doesn't require it either,
But
it doesn't.
it still has to meet county zoning. So if the county zoning in the undesignated area requires preservation of farmland or anything else, it would still have to meet the requirements of that zone.
Well, I'm sure that there's part of it that's EFU. Does that mean that you cannot use it for a transportation corridor?
No, it can be done. The higher, let's say the higher order of use, so if it's a exception land, it's a fairly easy process. If it's EFU or an EFC, exclusive farm or forest, it's a little more complicated process, higher burden of proof. If it's in an urban reserve, it's a pretty simple, straightforward process. Being undesignated, it plays by the same rules that we have been building roads by in the rural area for a number of years.
Yeah, I do. I think Steve has his hand up, and then we have a question over here. And over there. So 1, 2, 3.
Hi, Steve Lawrence here. I do believe in citizen participation in this. I've been a CPO 6 member since the 70s. Back in London, we get together with that. I too served as a county commissioner like Linda did for a while, 20 years ago. I wanted to disagree with one thing Linda said, and that's that the grand bargain did save all the best farmland, because South Hillsborough is some of the oldest, most fertile farmland in all of Washington County, and it was just thrown under the bus in the whole process. And let me tell you, I was the person that the city was kind enough to appoint me to be the sole representative for Aloha and Reedville, 60,000 people who were right next door when the process began in 1998 for South Hillsborough. it was obvious the first CAC meeting, Hillsborough had already made the decision to that's where they were going to go. So this wasn't about if we're going to do it, it's how we're going to do it. Maybe that was part of what the discussion was going to be. And I spoke about how it could be the pieces of the puzzle that were missing out of Aloha and Reedville. Our community plan always envisioned that area as jobs. And in fact, when I was an elected official, I supported the land and Reed Farm portion of it coming in because it was jobs. Metro turned it down. I think it was one of their first official acts after the boundary commission went away years ago. You remember that. And anyhow, so it was very interesting sitting on the CAC for that process because I was the only person representing somebody that didn't own property in the South Hillsborough. So it was a room full of people soon to become millionaires, and me representing the 60,000 people outside saying, what about the impacts? And I had very little, I don't even know that there was any votes. And kind of like another old classmate of mine from Ohio, Dave Nash, when he was sitting on the legislative group, we had no vote, really. And it was just, I just wanted to get that out there, that there's some really good farmland going under there. Right. Oregon State College started on the Land and Reed Farm.
Right.
So again, there's a real history to that whole area.
And as we get urban growth in the Willamette Valley, and particularly if we get anything like the population growth we're expecting over the next number of years, it's still going to remain a struggle, even with 50-year land designations, to save the best farmland. That's going to be our contribution to Dave's legacy if we are successful. But there was a question over here.
One of the decisions that came out of the urban and rural reserves process that disturbed me greatly and still disturbs me today was that any urban reserve land that comes inside the urban growth boundary must be annexed to a city when it comes in. Now, there are some parcels there. The parcel north of West Union is nowhere near a city. There's another one further up, 185th. That's some cherry's domain.
It's an old tradition. Everyone know what a cherry stem is?
No.
It's where you have a city or something, and you've got another piece of land over here, and that's the cherry, and the only way to get it is by creating a stem of jurisdiction along the road or something that gets you to that pocket of land.
Oftentimes on a commercial strip, maybe?
Oftentimes on a commercial strip, could be. Yeah.
So I just wanted to, back to maybe Steve's point, and generally, I think, part of the whole point of the urban reserves process and rural reserves process was really this notion that we have to arrive at some sort of a balance. We know we've got a lot of great farmland out here, but we know we also are, like Ethan was saying, over time, we know that we are going to have to grow. So this whole thing is really just about how you try to find a fair balance between those things. And so that's really what the whole genesis of this was. So very complex, very difficult decisions, and at the end of the day, there's going to be somebody that walks away from the table that isn't happy. That's just sort of the nature of this kind of a process, I think. So that's just the challenge, and I think, you raise a great point. How do we do this in a way where we try to minimize the amount of farmland that we're using? But at the end of the day, I just don't think it's possible to just say we're going to limit ourselves to the existing urban growth boundary and we live within that. So that's the challenge.
Growth and how to serve.
Right.
Well, we'll come back to that. Which is a whole other question.
Gold one I know is very important.
Say again?
Gold one is very important. And with these maps and future maps, how is that going to work in the future?
How will they work with the future of Goal 1?
Yeah, how is that going to work Goal 1?
Okay, so Goal 1, citizen involvement. I think the answer we've gotten, but I'll let these guys respond, is that Goal 1 doesn't change because of these maps, but probably the faith of people who participated in the process that finally got us to these maps is pretty shaken by what happened in their involvement or lack of involvement and how it played out. So Goal 1 is still there. It's still a requirement. It's going to happen. There are numerous points in this process coming up. Believe me, there will be meetings to go to for years to come. But the question ultimately, I think, that people have raised here is, what can we believe that it's a good use of our time? Is it real?
Can I say, even in the future, beyond, how's that?
Even in the future?
Yeah, I mean, beyond these maps and things that are happening, how is that going to work?
That's a good question. Yeah. Sure.
That's why we have elections, so you have a candidates forum, that very point of trust, and who is your leader and who's going to follow through on what they promised. Because once they're there, the kings of the county, you got 5 gentlemen right now. Once they're elected, we live in a democratic republic. Then they can make whatever decisions they want once they're in the seat, and they aren't accountable until the next election. That's the problem. So we all have choices. It's coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Jason Miner. I'm the executive director of 1000 Friends of Oregon. And for those of you who don't know, we were one of 13, I think, appellants of the Urban Rural Reserves process. And probably the most universal one in terms of looking all across the landscape. Other people appeal certain segments of it. From my perspective, the Goal 1 question is huge. And I think we were involved in the reserves process prior to the initial LCDC decision, which Linda Peters referenced, where LCDC threw out the work that had been done by Washington County and indicated that they needed to go back to the drawing board on a variety of factors. The approach at that point was to continue searching for the same number of acres to be in urban reserves. It was land thrown out of urban reserves that met the criteria for rural reserves. At that time, I think it would have been a great decision to go forward just having flipped those to rural reserves and call it a day. That's not what happened, and that was the basis, or one of the many bases for our appeal. As I think was mentioned, we won primarily on the criteria that the court determined that Washington County applied pseudo-factors in lieu of actual factors to describe what rural reserve should be. And then it didn't even get to the rest of our arguments, actually. It's throughout the
That's
reserves.
enough. That's enough. We're done.
Yeah, there are other things raised. Didn't get to the rest of the arguments. From my perspective, the legislature created reserves, rural reserves, in 2007. And said that that's valuable. 50 years of certainty for farmers is valuable. Court of Appeals said Metro has the authority to do it, but Washington County did it incorrectly in this case. All the elected officials said, we are not going to go back and do this process again. We just aren't going to do it. And so at that point, there was no future for rural reserves, a concept that the legislature had said is valuable, and that I think the majority of this room believes is valuable, unless the legislature stepped in and did something. And it's not atypical for a legislature anywhere around the country to, in the wake of a court ruling, decide that they want to establish the law. And in this case, it's the same law. Senate, or 1011 was the law that was passed in 2007 that established reserves. So the legislature stepped back in and essentially called the score at the end of the day. The thing that I am deeply concerned about is the way that people are claiming precedent today. That this is precedent for what? Precedent for blowing up the Bend UGB, precedent for blowing up the Woodburn UGB, precedent for blowing up the Springfield UGB. This isn't precedent for any of those things. This is not precedent for a bunch of people getting together and making a consensus decision. While that is impressive, this is precedent. What I have told newspapers is, if you want to come forward and say our local government failed in process, and if you want to designate 4,000 or so acres of rural reserve, and if you want to begin a process that way, maybe this is precedent for something, but it's not precedent for trampling all over Goal 1. And I think there's a huge risk right now, and I encourage everybody in the room to get very involved right now and in the year to come, because I think big things are coming, and we need to care about land use, and we need to care about Goal 1 in ways we have not cared about it for maybe 10, 20 years. And if there's one good thing that came out of the short session, is that the major story around the legislature was a land use story. People got interested in it again. People got interested in the idea of 50 years of certainty around farmland again. And if if the precedent that comes out of this is that the same old opponents of land use planning go around saying the system is broken and it's far too complex to understand what farmland is and what urbanizable or good land for urbanization is, that's a huge loss. But if the precedent is owned by citizens who care about land use, just like in 73, 74, 75, with the citizens who define the goals, then we have an opportunity really to really reignite the passion that is involved in land use, and that I know John feels, and I know that all planners feel, and many feel kind of like they're ignored. But we have an opportunity to ignite that now, and it will be serious in the coming year. And I encourage you all to get involved and make Goal 1 meaningful, because I've started my career getting people out to public meetings, and I can't tell you how frustrating it is to encourage people you care about to get out to a public meeting and know that their input made no difference whatsoever. So I think the big challenge ahead of us is how to make Goal 1 meaningful. I think John, Linda are on the right track. I know that planners care about it, and I think they would rather see more of us at their meetings than fewer. And from my perspective, it's up to us to define the precedent that was set here today.
And let me just add to that CPOs, and you're all members of CPO here, CPOs own Goal 1. You don't have to be a transportation expert to own Goal 1. You don't have to be kind of a soil scientist to own Goal 1. You don't have to be an economist to own Goal 1. All you have to be is a citizen, caring about your community. And if we leave Goal 1 up to the courts or the legislature or people who don't care about the fact that actually it's yours, it's going to be gone. So, it all seems complicated. If there's one thing, to hold on to, is that Goal 1 is yours, don't let it get away. This is kind of the moment. Yeah.
That's a really, really good point. I could not agree with you more. The other side of that is that you have to step up and take ownership. You own it, but you have to demonstrate that ownership. Personally, I think Senate Bill 100, Goal 1 should be top of mind for all of us until we get it back to a stable state. I think Linda made the point that the process is not broken. I think I agree with that, but also the process is very old. It probably does need to be revised a little bit, but we've all got a part in that division. I think Goal 1, top of mind, awareness.
Over here.
Yeah, I've been involved with citizen participation for quite a number of years. The problem with Goal 1 is that it doesn't have any teeth. There's no Oregon administrative rules associated with Goal 1 or 2. I think it would be very helpful if there were. I was involved with a group that actually won a case around Goal 1, but it was a situation where Hillsborough had ordinances and comprehensive plans that didn't match. Comprehensive plan said citizens will be active. There was an ordinance that said, oh, well, if we get an application for development, the planning commission can't vote no. So you could go and testify all you wanted, but the planning commission had to approve it. Went to the state Supreme Court and we won. But you have to have something that cut and dried to win in Goal 1. Otherwise, there's no Oregon administrative rules on it, and no attorneys will carry it for you. We've got to get to the legislature to get some more.
Thank you.
Ethan and I have a little bit of a process comment.
Yeah.
We're running up on 9 o'clock. I'm not sure how long we have this room.
We can stay till 9:30.
But we've got, this is a really excellent discussion. We'd like to see this continue, but we've also got some really excellent cards that we collected. I'm not sure that we're going to get through all the cards tonight. What we're going to try to do, though, is take your cards, get them recorded, and you're going to post it on some kind of an internet media, a CPO Google group, so that you can look at the questions and maybe an answer to the best of an answer.
There's a lot of fairly technical questions here about industrial land densities, transportation, service designations, and so forth. And I'm not sure how deeply we want to dive into those at this point. We may want to.
Well, I think the second part was primarily aimed at gathering comments, and those comments are in the form of a
Good. Okay.
They'll set the stage for maybe another
Okay.
session.
Well, I've got a question here that I'm going to bring up, but Linda, you've got something you wanted to
I
say?
just want to add one more thing on Gold One, because I think it would be of interest. A number of us in CPO and also with Washington County Citizen Action Network, which I know some of you know about, have been in the process of trying to forge a legislative agenda that we can take to the legislature and get them to actually form a study committee or take the first steps toward adopting, defining and adopting the administrative rules for the enforcement of Goal 1 and Goal 2. And Washington County Citizen Action Network is going to be having its annual meeting on March 22nd. I've got a handout on the back table there if you're interested. That's one of the things that we will be talking about. Russ Mondero is our legislative representative, and you can meet with him or with some. We may have a land use table as well. There are some very specific things that we want to be prepared to ask of the next legislature, and if you care about making Goal 1 meaningful and keeping teeth in it, or giving it teeth, that's one way you can work.
Okay.
To make
Thank
that
you.
happen.
Yeah. You know, there's a bunch of questions here, comments about, well, what does 50 years certainty mean? I mean, what were you doing 50 years ago? And did you ever think you'd be here tonight? You know, it's another way of kind of looking at it. But what about this notion of 50 years certainty? What can we count on? What ought we to be able to count on? You guys want to, what do Washington County say about that?
It's a great question. I think, the whole point of this was to try to establish some certainty for 50 years, but, Ethan raises a great point. What's the world going to look like in 50 years? I don't really know. We're starting on a process of looking at our transportation system, and we're trying to the reason we're trying to look ahead 50 years.
Will there be public involvement in that process?
There will be, as a matter of fact.
Will there be a process coming up about the transportation plan?
Yes.
Which could have a huge impact on
It's a study, yeah.
A
But the idea, we sort of picked this sort of idea of a 40 to 50 year horizon to sort of mesh with the concept of the reserves. So it's difficult. I mean, that's a real challenge. We don't know what transportation is going to look like in 50 years from now. It's probably not going to look quite like it does today, but what it will look like, we don't really know. So I think we've got some challenges ahead of us to try to envision what the future looks like. And again, I think we'll want to hear from everybody. And we're trying to understand. We've got a lot of pressing needs today, but we want to look ahead as long term as we can.
And so I'd like to seed that discussion for you a little bit. Recently, a lot of land in our area was changed from urban reserve to rural reserve. I live north of Hillsborough, north of the airport. Washington County's been planning on putting a roundabout in that area, and now it's all rural reserve. Very difficult. Are you going to continue with that plan?
I believe so.
I thought you couldn't put those in the
part of
area.
as part of the process. Well, we can improve existing roads. There's an issue about creating new roads or putting in urban roads in a rural area, so that's part of the challenge. But I mean, there's nothing in the law that would preclude us from making improvements on existing rural roads. So, but that's one of the things that we're going to have to look at. We've got to take a look at. I mean, does this have any implications for that particular project or other?
We're not supposed to build an urban thoroughfare in a rural area, right?
The road's there. We'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So suffice it to say that what this map is going to set in motion are a whole lot of questions just like this one. What can you or can't you do in these areas which are now rural or urban reserve or undesignated? Yeah, how?
This area that's where Bob was directed up in North Hillsborough, so that's going to be designated now as a
Hold on, everybody.
As an existing urban reserve. Urban reserve, it's part of the UGB. I think they used the term down at the state Senate Rules Committee when I went down there to testify. They called it a converted UGB. So instead of a UGB process, in this bill, they actually jumped and did a two-step by already converting it to a already approved UGB. And so that will all be industrialized up there in North Hillsborough in that pink and red area, or just the red area. Yeah, so it's called confirmed urban reserve. Yeah, urban UGB. So those areas are going to become urbanized. They're going to be streets. The city's going to dive in there and spend all sorts of City of Hillsborough tax dollars and service that area. what companies are coming here? I mean, who are we marketing to? Because I've made the statement, it's not how we grow, it's also where we grow, the businesses that we're going to bring in. So like data centers that have filtered into the area that use up the cheap hydroelectric power, they bring blue-collar jobs. They fill their buildings with database equipment. That doesn't do us any good. That doesn't bring a tax base for things like that. That just takes up more real estate and makes our electricity more expensive.
So someone mentioned this word before. I've never actually quite heard it this way, used this way, but granularity. In other words, within every one of these designations on the map, there are, the details matter. And kind of what happens is going to unfold through subsequent processes. And paying attention, figuring out how to pay attention, and probably figuring out how all of you working together can figure out how you collectively can pay attention without having to go to every individual meeting yourselves is probably not a bad idea. Because this is going to be about the strategic use of your time going forward. All these questions will get worked out, but they're all going to be involved in oftentimes separate processes. Yeah?
Even separate processes is huge when you talk about CPOs, because CPOs are going to be primarily who? Primarily residents, right? But I mean, a CPO is supposed to be this balanced forum, and one of the things you try to convince people in public involvement of these so-called value propositions is if you do it right ahead of time, then you'll save a little bit of money, energy, time, and effort, or maybe a lot, and have it be really done poorly or wrong at the end. And in the meantime, for every individual person or a group of people, like around a neighborhood or something, they can come together at a CPO, and that collection of voices can get to the table, and you're at the table instead of being on the menu. But there are going to be several different tables, and there are going to be several different menus. And so one of the things we preach in CPOs, and I have a great audience in here to preach right now, is balance of viewpoints. Is anyone in here feeling like they represent economic development, jobs? Washington County has probably the lowest unemployment rate in the state. There's one. Raise your hand high, be proud.
All right.
Okay, now who here is from CPO 9? Raise your hand. Great. CPO 9 really needs help. Go to the meetings, volunteer for officer positions. Who here is from CPO 8? Great. And who here is from some other CPO? Great. Awesome. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, yes.
Which area are they going to actually break ground this year?
Which area will break ground this year is the question.
So South Hillsborough is fairly close. It's
this part of South Hillsborough.
Same area.
Right. Yeah. So my understanding, and we'll be hearing from them tomorrow morning at a Board of Commissioners work session, sort of an update on the plan. But my understanding is they'll start at the north end, and the development will eventually sort of progress.
And then what is how many years are they going to take to finish that area?
It's really going to depend on the market, quite honestly. I mean, we were planning the North Bethany area up north in the county there. And within less than a year, we've heard from a fifth, owners that control land that could accommodate up to a fifth of the ultimate planned densities. So we've either had some initial contact with them, or they've actually submitted a development application, or we've met with them to discuss potential development plans. Doesn't mean those are all going to develop within the next 5 years, but we're seeing a lot of interest in there.
But
So
South Hillsborough is going to take, it's going to start this year, and it's going to take 5 years to finish.
I don't know. Again, it's just really a market function.
It's geared for 20.
The South Hillsborough group now has been enlarged all the way to River Road.
There was apparently some discussion at one time during the bargaining about bringing in some additional area down in that part of Hillsborough, but it didn't fit their roadmap. So the pink portion there, that was the 2011 expansion, still stands as is.
As is.
As is.
Right. That extension west is still urban reserve.
Give some other people a chance, because I saw. Okay. Oh, back here and then over here. Yeah.
One of the issues that we have in our CPO is that as areas are brought inside the urban growth boundary, they need to be owned by a city, in a sense. A city has to step forward and say, we will annex, we will do the planning. Many of the people within our area are in urban unincorporated Washington County. They do not vote for the elected officials within that city. Any thoughts on how those of us who do not pay city taxes can stay engaged in those city processes?
That is an
Join the city, Mary.
That is an age-old question, and actually his answer is absolutely true.
I would if I could, but I'm too far away. They won't cherry stem to my house.
We actually kind of frown on cherry stemming, actually. But it's a really interesting question. You know, I think the objective is that the ultimate provider of urban services should be a city. That counties don't want to be in the urban service provision business. And when you think about it, in most cases, when counties provide urban services, everyone in the county is paying for that, whether they're also paying in a city or not. And so there's a kind of an urban subsidy that kind of goes on that can really affect, you know, how things get paid for outside of cities. But if you are outside of the city and you don't want to go into the city, oftentimes it's because it's kind of a great deal, right? You know,
Or you don't understand what a city will provide you.
or you don't understand what a city will provide, or you don't value what a city will provide. Could be any of those things. But that's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. It's been a challenge in Oregon for a long time. I'm looking at Russ because I know as a political science issue, you know, our kind of this is kind of a classic American governance problem. And all I can say is that the only way to kind of resolve it locally is either through your county commissioner, who is supposed to be representing you, or convincing your neighbors that it's time to go into the city.
Well, but in the case of the reserve process, my county commissioner got thrown out of the room.
Yeah.
Yeah. Quick comment. I think really what your question underscores is a very profound dilemma in American governance between urban and rural, and now urban-rural and suburban America. And we got to get over this. I live in Forest Grove. I've lived there since 1974. I do not live in an urban reserve. I do not live in urban Washington County. So I live in the city of Forest Grove. But I'm here tonight because I deeply care about the values of protecting this wonderful state and the quality of life that means we all have to work together.
Absolutely. We got time for
a comment. The bill 4078 includes service districts. The city of Hillsborough, as well as 12th Valley Fire, are providing for a number of district areas, which include North Jefferson and Aloha.
We got time for like one more question. You've had your hand up for a while.
I have a really easy question.
Okay.
I haven't been to Phoenix, so it's kind of like I forgot to get my master's in urban planning before I dropped it.
That's exactly the point. You don't need a master's in urban planning to be a citizen. Okay.
The first thing is, a lot of information was shared tonight. How does this plan be communicated out? A lot of comments, a lot of questions. Is there a website which we can get more information? Secondly, along that website, will Metro own, or whoever's going to own getting this map out, for those of us to communicate? And the third question is, with all these changes that are occurring, I was trying to discuss this with Comcast corporate headquarters today, of what that meant for getting basic phone service, which we have really crappy, out in our area, that there is this large change. How will this be communicated to Joe Guy like me, and that cares, but doesn't want to attend every meeting?
You know, that is a great question, and we've got 3 answers to the effort that's going to be made in the next 72 hours to get all this information out. Washington County Metro, and then we'll end with Dan. Dan, we're coming back to you as the final word on this question. So, Washington County, what's the program for getting people kind of back around the table now that this is all down?
So what we're trying to do, we have an urban and rural reserves page on the county website. Metro has one as well. So we're both posting updates to that site as we get additional information. The map that you see there will be posted tomorrow. We had an earlier version of the map that's out there now, but it has a couple of inaccuracies, so we corrected that. This one's hot off the presses. But I think, you know, we've got some newsletters that our Department of Land Use and Transportation of the county, I send out a weekly email subscription just to kind of give you a heads up about what's going on around the county that we may be interested in. We've got the the CPO newsletters Dan will probably touch on. We try to coordinate with the CPOs to try to help find out if there's information that's pertinent to folks. They're going to try to get it into their newsletters. I have a quarterly newsletter that we do in land use and transportation. You can sign up for that as well. So we're trying to, get the word out as much as we can. This has been attracting some attention in the media as well. So watch the Oregon Line side. And so back to goal one. I mean, I'm a communications coordinator, so I'm here to try to help answer questions. And if we're not getting information out that would be useful to you, let me know that, and I'll give you my card. And I'd be happy to chat with you.
Well, maybe
you got gaps.
You can put his email address in your next newsletter or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're also working to update, we'll have like a updated frequently asked questions. That'll be the first thing. And then later on, there'll be a reserves webpage that will not be changed for 50 years. That'll be great.
Put it on a floppy disk, exactly.
And so let me, just one other thing I mentioned, I talked to some tonight about the next urban growth boundary decision. Metro's also has a webpage on that. We're working to get that updated. And I'll also say, if you're interested, I'd be happy to come back maybe with one or two of my staff folks. If you're interested in hearing more about that this summer or this fall, that would probably be the right time. We'll have completed our initial assessment. We'll come out and talk to you about it. I'd be happy to do that.
And before I hand this over to Dan and back to the CPOs, I just want to say we should thank these two guys for coming out. They're basically standing in for their bosses. All of our questions, kind of stood up here when we told them we were going to let them sit down. So yeah, thank you guys.
I did say that.
Awfully nice. Thank you. So Dan, you want to say something?
Well, thank you, Ethan, for coming out yourself. Everyone, thank you. OSU Extension has a website with all the CPOs that are active, and to be active means you have volunteer leaders like Henry and Tom and Pat Walter. Raise your hand if you're a CPO officer now or in the past. You can scan these questions. Let's just take the question record here and scan it and put it on the home page, the subpage for CPO 8 and 9, and you guys can go forward and start to work with it. We'll be here.